Hello, everyone. It's Mama, and I'm here to shed some light. We are going to continue our series about miracles, and I will continue to read The Case for Miracles by Lee Strobel. And we are now into part 1, which asks the question, do miracles really happen? And chapter 1 is entitled, What About Science? Marguerite was a small girl when she developed an open sore at the corner of her left eye. Despite ongoing treatment, the sore continued to worsen to the point it began to eat away at her bones on the inside of her nose and the roof of her mouth. She lost her sense of smell and had trouble eating, sleeping, and even breathing. The odor from the sore was so repulsive that Marguerite was kept away from other children. Her condition was considered hopeless. Then one day, after years of suffering while Marguerite was praying with others in the chapel, she was completely healed. Even the evidence of bone deterioration vanished immediately. Medical and eyewitnesses evidenced verified the healing. In the following months, 80 other miracle claims followed. But one man insisted that the healings were not miraculous. Oh, and this happened in 1656. The Laws of Nature. Why do I tell you a story about one man's word against many, several hundred years ago? Because the man was a philosopher named David Hume, and his work is still influential today, not just in philosophy, but in science. Here's a quick overview of what he said about miracles. Number 1, a miracle is something that breaks the laws of nature. Number 2, the laws of nature can't be broken. Number 3, therefore, miracles do not exist. A quick Google search on science and miracles showed me that this view is still common. Here's what one professor of physics says about the prevalent view today. All explanation in modern science rests ultimately on the assumption that nature follows, quote, universal laws. That is, laws that apply in all time, places, and circumstances throughout the universe, end quote. Follow that? It's basically Hume's point 2 above. The professor continues, quote, but many of the miracles in which religious people believe would certainly violate the laws of physics, end quote. That's what Hume says in point 1. Quote, it is this that leads some to conclude that miracles are quite simply impossible, end quote. Hume's point 3. So what does that mean? Do you have to reject science in order to believe that miracles can happen? Interrupted, not broken. Here's the best example I've heard. Imagine I'm holding a pen. If I drop it, the law of gravity tells me it will fall to the floor. But if I were to reach out and grab the pen in midair, I wouldn't be breaking the law of gravity. I would merely be intervening. And certainly if God exists, he would have the ability to intervene in the world that he himself created. Instead of saying that miracles break the laws of nature, it would be better to say that a miracle is a temporary exception to the ordinary course of nature. Is that unscientific? Some people would say so. A friend of mine told me the story of talking with his professor about miracles. The professor dismissed every bit of evidence my friend gave. Finally, my friend asked him, if somebody were raised from the dead in front of you, would you believe it? The professor answered, no. In my opinion, that's bad science. The professor was unwilling to consider the evidence because he had already decided in advance that miracles were impossible. If you insist that miracles have a 0 chance of ever happening, as the professor did, then you're not going to find any. But if you keep an open mind and follow the evidence wherever it leads, well, it might take you to unexpected places. A scientific study of miracles. Dr. Michael Shermer is probably the most famous doubter in the United States, and even founded and edits a magazine called Skeptic. I knew he didn't believe in anything supernatural, not God, and certainly not miracles. I wanted to hear what he had to say on the subject, so I went to talk with him in his office in Los Angeles. As he spoke, and I spoke, it was clear to me that Dr. Shermer wasn't skeptical about everything in this world. So I asked, How do you define skeptic? It's taking a scientific approach to claims. The burden of proof should be on the claimant. The Food and Drug Administration doesn't approve a drug just because you say it works. The burden of proof isn't on them. You have to prove the drug works, and it should be like that with all claims. I asked Shermer whether he agreed with the scientist Jerry Coyne in the University of Chicago, an atheist who said it would be a closed-minded scientist who would say that miracles are impossible in principle. Coyne added that to have real confidence in a miracle, one needs evidence, massive, well-documented, and either replicated or independently corroborated evidence from multiple and reliable sources. His conclusion? No religious miracle even comes close to meeting those standards. I'd tend to agree, Shermer replied. I doubt if there's something supernatural outside of space and time that intervenes in our world, but if it were, we would be able to measure its effects, and if it reaches into our environment, then it's part of the natural world, not supernatural. So, I said, you wouldn't be opposed to investigation of seemingly miraculous events? Not at all. Let's check them out as best we can. Let's test them. Bring on the evidence. As Coyne said, we can't rule them out in principle, but I don't think there's sufficient proof of anything miraculous. Dr. Shermer went on to say that the problem with stories about healing and other miracles is that they're just that, stories. We need to study them scientifically, and when we do, guess what? Science doesn't support them. I'm sure you're familiar with STEP, S-T-E-P, the study of therapeutic effects of intercessory prayer. STEP was a 10-year, $2.4 million clinical trial of the effects of prayer on 1,802 cardiac bypass patients at 6 hospitals. Patients having cardiac bypass surgery were broken into 3 groups. One group was prayed for, and a second group was not, although nobody in either group knew for sure whether they were being uplifted in prayer. A third group was prayed for after being told they definitely would receive prayer. Then researchers tracked the number of complications from the surgeries. The results were very revealing, said Shermer. There was no difference in the rate of complications for patients who were prayed for and those who were not. Nothing. 0. And in fact, those who knew they were being prayed for had more complications. This is the best prayer study we have. So when you get beyond anecdotes and use the scientific method, there's no evidence for the miraculous. That's not good for your side, Lee. Studying the study. Did the STEP study really establish, as Dr. Shermer suggested, that when scientific analysis is applied, there is no persuasive evidence for the miraculous? That was the question prompting my journey to the campus of Indiana University in Bloomington. I checked my watch as I drove in my rental car. Still plenty of time to make the appointment with a scholar who was figuring out ways to use science to investigate faith. Candy Gunther Brown is a professor of religious studies at Indiana University. I do not assume the existence or non-existence of a deity or other superhuman force, she explains. What I argue is that people's religious beliefs often have real-world effects that can be studied scientifically. What brought me to Indiana was her focus on studying the impact of prayer on healing. Does prayer make a difference? I asked Dr. Brown for her opinion of the STEP project that Dr. Shermer had cited as having shown no impact or even a slightly harmful effect on recovering cardiac patients. I expected it would be a rather routine conversation, but frankly, I ended up thoroughly surprised, even stunned by what she said. Let me start by saying that there have been gold standard studies before and after STEP that reached the opposite conclusion, that the group receiving prayer had better outcomes, she said, and described 2 of them. Now I was confused. Then why do you think STEP reached such a different conclusion, I asked. That's where things get very interesting, she said. If you're going to study prayer, wouldn't it be important who's praying, who they were praying for, and how they were praying? That seemed obvious. Of course, I replied. In one of the studies, the people praying were born-again Protestants and Catholics who were active in daily devotional prayer and in fellowship with the local church. They were praying to the Judeo-Christian God. That made sense to me. As born-again believers, they would have faith in a personal God who is loving and who possesses the power and inclination to supernaturally intervene in people's lives. In another study, the intercessors were required to believe in a personal God who hears and answers prayers made on the behalf of the sick. Again, that seemed entirely appropriate. What about STEP, which found no beneficial effects of prayer, I asked. Here's where the difference comes in. The only Protestants recruited to participate in the study were from Silent Unity. Unity's leaders have long denied that prayer works miracles and have even called petitionary prayers useless, Dr. Brown answered. The group instead practices in what it calls affirmative prayer. Affirmative prayer involves repeating positive statements such as, "We are imbued with divinity and are physically healthy." Their website says, when most people think of prayer, they think of asking God for something. Not so in Unity. Unity uses affirmative prayer. Rather than begging or beseeching God, this method involves connecting with the Spirit of God within and asserting positive beliefs about the desired outcome. It's possible not everyone in the group has the same beliefs, but essentially Unity doesn't believe in miracles, doesn't believe in a personal God outside of us who intervenes in people's lives, and doesn't believe it's even appropriate to ask for supernatural help. So why do we see different results in STEP? Brown asked. Look who's doing the praying and how they're doing it. I thought for a few moments. This means you can't draw any conclusions about the effectiveness of traditional Christian prayer from STEP, I said. That's right, she replied. None. With Dr. Shermer's comments in the back of my mind, I asked, would you consider STEP to be definitive or final word on prayer research? No hesitation from Dr. Brown. Not at all, she said. I posed one more question along those lines. In the end, does this study tell us anything that's helpful? She thought a few moments. Well, she said, it is instructive on how not to conduct a study of Christian prayer. A better study. In addition to her specific critiques of STEP, Dr. Brown raised several concerns about the overall approach in these double-blind prayer studies. First, these studies don't take into consideration that healing seems to be clustered in certain geographical areas. Second, these studies don't recognize that certain people seem to have special anointing or success rate with healing prayer. Third, the people receiving prayer in these studies can't respond with faith because they don't even know someone is praying for them. So Dr. Brown conducted a study that takes these factors into consideration, and the results were fascinating. Miracles in Mozambique. To go to a place that's reporting clusters of healing, Dr. Brown and her team flew to Mozambique in Africa. Mozambique fits 4 characteristics author Tim Stafford, who's written on miracles, says are often shared in places where there are outbreaks of the supernatural. Number 1, there's illiteracy. Miracles show God's power without language. Number 2, people don't have a concept of sin and salvation. Stafford wrote, miracles demand attention even if you don't yet grasp the nature of your problem and God's redemption. Number 3, there's limited medical care, making miracles the only hope for the afflicted. And number 4, the spirit world is very real to people, and a conflict of spiritual powers is out in the open. Miracles are demonstrations of God's power. To connect with a ministry that reports a high success rate of healing, Bowen's team worked with Heidi and Roland Baker, missionaries serving in Mozambique for more than 20 years. They had described how healing miracles have accompanied the spread of the gospel there. Dr. Brown focused on the healing of the blind and deaf, or those with severe vision or hearing problems, because vision and hearing can be scientifically tested. Her team used standard tests and technical equipment to determine the person's level of hearing or vision immediately before prayer. After the prayers were concluded, the patient was promptly tested again. There was a woman who couldn't see a hand in front of her face at a foot away. Heidi Baker put her arms around this woman, smiled at her, hugged her. Then she cried and prayed for 1 minute. Afterward, the woman was able to read. In all, there were 24 subjects who received prayer. The results? We saw improvement in almost every single subject tested, Brown said. Some of the results were quite dramatic. Dr. Brown then mentioned the story of Martine, an elderly blind and deaf woman. Before prayer, Martine had no response at 100 decibels in either ear. That means she couldn't hear a jackhammer if it were being used next to her. After prayer, she responded at 75 decibels in her right ear and 40 decibels in her left ear, which means she could make out conversations. After a second prayer, Martine's eyesight improved from 2400 to 2080 on the vision chart. This would mean she was initially legally blind, but after prayer, she was able to see objects from 20 feet away in the same way a person with normal vision can see that object from 80 feet away. Dr. Brown's methods were very simple. The only thing that changed between the pre-prayer and post-prayer tests was the fact that someone prayed to Jesus for the person to get better. And virtually everyone did improve to one degree or another, often astonishingly so. I asked Dr. Brown whether the study was scientifically sound, and she listed the requirements they met. It was published in a peer-reviewed medical journal, meaning doctors from outside the study were able to examine the methods and results. They had the proper equipment. They used a trained research team. They got statistically significant results. The study was evaluated and declared scientifically sound by the journal that published it. However, I pointed out, the number of tested people was pretty small. There's a misconception that if you got a small sample, it's not statistically significant. Actually, that's not true, she replied. With a smaller sample, the effects have to be larger and more consistent in order to achieve statistical significance, and our effects were. Dr. Brown and her team then did a study in Brazil to check if they would get similar results, and they did. Again, sight and hearing were improved after hands-on prayer was offered in Jesus' name. In São Paulo, for example, 48-year-old woman named Julia could not see details on faces or read without glasses. After prayer, she could do both. Dr. Brown said, and a 38-year-old woman in Uberlândia could not count fingers from 9 feet away. When she opened her eyes after prayer, she could read the name tag of the person who had been praying for her. Now, Dr. Brown's husband, Joshua, is spearheading the Global Medical Research Institute to apply strict scientific methods to investigate claims of miraculous healings. In the meantime, Candy Gunther Brown's work and analysis has already undermined Dr. Shermer's claim that when research is conducted scientifically, it shows zero evidence for the miraculous. Quite the opposite appears to be true. It seems that upon further study, the evidence is good for the Christian side. That's the end of chapter 1. Now, this chapter does sort of hone in on a specific set of scientific studies that try to find out whether or not prayer could actually statistically help someone. And some people might say that maybe they were fudging the results. I don't know. I haven't read the study, but it does seem pretty miraculous. As we get further into the book, you're going to see more and more stories about the peoples and the miracles that have happened to them, and you will be astonished by what has happened and how it has happened. I have also asked the group of people on my Twitter if anyone has had any miracles happen to them, and I'm looking for them to share with me so that I can share them with you. I would like to make my next video be about those miracles that both I have encountered in my life, that my friends and family have encountered, and that those of you who respond to me tell me about your miracles, and I will share them as well. So, contact me if you have any miracles, and I would love to share them with everyone. God bless, and have a great week.